Hello students, my name is Abhishek Sudhir and I am an assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School. Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we will be looking at Module 7, International and Regional Instruments on the Right to Freedom of Speech and Expression, which forms a part of paper Civil and Political Rights. The right to free speech and expression, without any shadow of a doubt, forms the basis for the democratic form of government which is present in a majority of the countries of the world. The importance of this right has not gone unrecognized in non-democratic regimes even, and the right has been made available in a more restricted form. This module seeks to acquaint students with some of the international and regional instruments that have reaffirmed the importance of the right to free speech and expression. What are the learning outcomes of this module? Well, the purpose of this module is twofold. First, this module aims to give the students an overview of the internationally recognized components of an individual's right to freedom of speech and expression. Second, this module aims to help the students understand the manner in which this right is protected by some of the major and regional instruments. And these regional instruments and these international and regional instruments have been passed by a majority of nations around the world. Therefore, by the end of this module, the students should have a basic understanding of the regulatory framework of human rights, both internationally and regionally, in going by continent by continent. For example, Asia, North America, South America, Africa, and the European Union. Let's start with the International Bill of Rights and the right to freedom of speech and expression. The International Bill of Rights is a name that is used for three instruments that are collectively known as the International Bill of Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed in 1948, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, passed in 1976, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also passed in 1976. Let's begin with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948. You're now looking at an artifact of the UDHR. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 10th of December, 1948, with a vote of 48 in favor and none against. The instrument was passed unanimously. The declaration, though in itself is said to be non-binding, it has arguably attained the status of customary international law and is binding, albeit indirectly. What this basically means is that although specific provisions of the declaration cannot be invoked, the major principles underlying the declaration can and are recognized in courts around the world, including the courts in India, which give the Universal Declaration of Human Rights pride of place when interpreting our own chapter on fundamental rights in the Constitution. Let's now go to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 19 of the UDHR stipulates that, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And this right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. This article is worth breaking down. Let's start with the first line. It says everyone has the right to the freedom of opinion and expression. It does not use the words speech, but opinion and expression. The right is said to include the freedom to hold these opinions without interference, presumably sanctions, and any physical interference. And the right is so wide that it includes the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information. This is revolutionary. Look at it as it says to seek, receive, and most importantly, impart. Receive is unique because nowhere in the Indian Constitution, for example, do you have the right to receive information. You have the right to impart it as part of your right to free speech and expression. However, the right to receive information, thanks to the Supreme Court of India, has now been given constitutional standing through the Right to Information and subsequently by Parliament as well with the Right to Information Act, something that was recognized in the UDHR way back in 1948. And you have the right to receive, impart, and seek this information through any media visual, audiovisual, any media, and regardless of frontiers. Here, this being an international instrument, it's very important for Article 19 to stress that this right is sacrosanct and applies to nations, and the borders don't operate as any limit. Now let's come to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR. The ICCPR is a multilateral treaty adopted by the UN General Assembly on 16 December 1966 and has been in force from 23rd March 1976. At present, 168 countries are a party to the ICCPR and 74 countries are signatories. The declaration is monitored by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which regularly audits the status of the implementation of the declaration in different nations. Essentially, the Human Rights Committee acts as a monitoring body. What is the mandate of the Human Rights Committee? It's very simple. It was formed under Article 40 of the ICCPR, and it can issue its observations on non-compliance of articles of the ICCPR by member states, basically states that have signed the ICCPR. Now let's come to the all-important Article 19 of the ICCPR. Article 19 of the ICCPR stipulates everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Article 19 Clause 2 stipulates everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of his choice. How is this different from Article 19 of the UDHR? In a very small but significant way. Essentially, they clarify that information may also be received orally, in writing, or in print, and in the form of art or through any other media of his choice. So, Article 19 of the ICCPR explicitly states that pictorial depictions also count as speech. Clause 3 of Article 9 states that the exercise of the rights provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary. So Article 19 of the ICCPR, goes beyond Article 19 of the UDHR and mandates that certain restrictions are permissible on the right to free speech and the right to impart, seek, and receive information. Now, what are these restrictions? Well, for starters, those restrictions are permissible only if they are provided by law and are necessary. So, two tests: they have to first be provided by law, and they have to be necessary in a member state, basically. So, if India is to restrict the right to free speech and expression, the restriction must be provided by law, i.e., by an act passed by Parliament, and must be necessary. Okay, so let's look at what kind of restrictions are permissible. A, for respect of the rights or reputation of others, essentially defamation. The ICCPR states you can restrict the right to free speech and expression in the interests of defamation, i.e., protecting the rights or reputation of others. For the protection of national security or of public order or public health or morals. This is very similar to, incidentally, our own Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. You might notice that the UDHR, the ICCPR, and the Constitution of India all deal with free speech and expression, and all articles are numbered 19. For the protection of national security, public order, or public health or morals. Very similar, like I said, to our own Constitution. Now let's come to some general comments that have been made by the Human Rights Committee. General comments essentially are clarifications issued by the concerned authorities from time to time so as to fill in any lacunae and help in a better understanding of particular provision of international instruments with regards to their scope and applicability. General comment number 34 is extremely important in this context. Here's what para 9 of the general comment states. Paragraph 1 of Article 19 requires the protection of the right to hold opinions without interference. This is a right which the ICCPR permits no exception or restriction. Freedom of opinion extends to the right to change an opinion whenever and for whatever reason a person so freely chooses. No person may be subject to the impairment of any rights under the ICCPR on the basis of his or her actual, perceived, or supposed opinions. So, they're clarifying that all forms of opinion are protected, including opinions of a political nature, a scientific, historic, moral, or religious nature. They say that it is incompatible with paragraph 1 of Article 19 to criminally punish, to criminalize the holding of an opinion, the harassment, intimidation, or stigmatization of a person, including arrest, detention, trial, or imprisonment for reasons of the opinions they may hold, according to the Human Rights Committee, constitutes a violation of Article 19, paragraph 1 of the ICCPR. The general comment continues, and I quote, any form of effort to coerce the holding or not holding of any opinion is prohibited. Freedom to express one's opinion necessarily includes freedom not to express one's opinion. So again, the ICCPR tries to be as comprehensive as possible and goes to the extent of saying one not only has the right to hold an opinion, but one also has the right and the freedom not to express that opinion if they choose not to. Now let's come to an interesting instrument, a regional instrument, known as rather an international instrument still, known as the Johannesburg Principles on National Security, Freedom of Expression, and Access to Information. The Johannesburg Declaration consists of 22 principles adopted by a group of experts in international law, national security, and human rights at Johannesburg on 1st October 1995. The principles were essentially passed with an intention to amplify Article 19 of the ICCPR, essentially add to Article 19 of the ICCPR, but at the same time, they wanted to balance issues concerning national security with the freedom of expression. They wanted to draw a fine line between the two. The principles, the Johannesburg Principles, are based on international and regional law and standards relating to the protection of human rights, evolving state practices, and the general principles of law recognized by the Committee of Nations. The principles have been endorsed by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression in his reports to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and referred to by the Commission in their annual resolutions on freedom of expression every year since 1996. So, although the Johannesburg Principles were passed by a set of experts who weren't exactly state actors and weren't acting on behalf of member states, the principles have been given pride of place in the pantheon of human rights instruments by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and has been referred to by the Commission annually. Therefore, these principles are best not ignored. Therefore, let us consider some of the principles, the Johannesburg Principles, in detail. Principle 1 goes as follows: freedom of opinion, expression, and information. Everyone has the right to hold opinions without interference. That's essentially a reproduction of Article 19 of the ICCPR. B. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the forms of art, or through any other media of his or her choice. Again, verbatim repeat of Article 19. Now, C, they say that the exercise of the rights provided for in paragraph B may be subject to restrictions on specific grounds, as established in international law, including for the protection of national security. Now, this is interesting. Here is where the Johannesburg Principles essentially depart from Article 19 of the ICCPR, and they say that these restrictions must be A, on specific grounds, as established in international law. So therefore, unlike the ICCPR, which simply says prescribed by law, without essentially saying domestic law or international law, the Johannesburg Principles go to the extent of saying that these principles have to be established in international law, which essentially means that even though you might be a member state to the covenant, to the ICCPR, you essentially, if these principles had the binding force of law, would be deprived of restricting free speech on the basis of your own principles in your own country. So let's take an example. In India, hate speech, for example, is criminalized. Now the question is, internationally, in international law, is hate speech criminalized? India restriction of free speech and expression, if the Joburg principles were to be incorporated in the ICCPR, would essentially be irrelevant. What would matter is one set standard internationally for restricting free speech and expression, which was essentially the reason the Joburg principles were crafted in the first place. D. The Joburg principles continue. No restriction on freedom of expression or information on the ground of national security may be imposed unless the government can demonstrate that the restriction is prescribed by law and is necessary in a democratic society to protect a legitimate national security interest. So again, they are going further than the ICCPR, and they are saying that that member state, that domestic, that state must demonstrate that the restriction is not only that it's just prescribed by law, but that restriction is actually necessary in a democratic society to protect a legitimate national security interest. It has to be a legitimate national security interest. The burden of demonstrating the validity, of course, rests with the government that seeks to restrict free speech. Principle 1.1. Here, the Joburg principles deal with the notion of prescribed by law. Any restriction on expression or information must be prescribed by law. The law must be accessible, unambiguous, drawn narrowly, and with precision so as to enable individuals to foresee whether a particular action is unlawful. So, at Joburg, these experts decided that prescribed by law was far too wide and the scope needed to be narrowed. Any law must be accessible, unambiguous. It must be clear. It must be narrow in its scope. It must be precise. You cannot have a very abstract law that just restricts free speech in abstract terms. It should be concrete. The law should provide for adequate safeguards against abuse, including prompt, full, and effective judicial scrutiny of the validity of the restriction by an independent court or tribunal. Again, stressing that even if the law is strict and narrowly drawn, there must be immediate or judicial scrutiny of that law or restriction. Principle 1.2 of the Joburg Principles, protection of a legitimate national security interest. Here, the experts sought to define the term national security interest. Any restriction on expression or information that a government seeks to justify on grounds of national security must have a genuine purpose and demonstrable effect of protecting a legitimate national security interest. Of course, this is a question of fact, but the Joburg principles say that the purpose must be genuine. It cannot just be a purpose to serve the agenda of the government of the day. You're now looking at the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and a signing of this convention. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was adopted and opened for signature by the UN General Assembly on 21st December 1965, and it entered into force on 4th January 1969. At present, the convention has 87 signatories and 177 parties. This convention is unique in certain aspects as it includes in itself an individual complaints mechanism, effectively making it enforceable against its parties. So this is again something novel. An individual can complain of a violation of the treaty, of the convention. The convention also requires regular reporting as to its implementation by party states to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Unfortunately, this has not really been effective. Many parties do not report it, with some not reporting for decades, and our own country, India, has also not reported on several international conventions for quite some time. And this is quite sad. Now let's look at some of the articles of this Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The Convention, in its Article 5, protects again the freedom of opinion and expression. In compliance with the fundamental obligations laid down in Article 2 of the Convention, the states parties undertake to prohibit and to eliminate racial discrimination in all its forms and to guarantee the right of everyone without distinction as to race, color, national or ethnic origin to equality before the law, notably in the enjoyment of the following rights: the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Again, you might ask yourself, how exactly is this different from the UDHR and the ICCPR? The answer is it is because here the convention is tailored to a particular section of the community, essentially those who are racial or ethnic minorities. And it says that these minorities, on account of them being a minority or belonging to a particular race or creed, cannot be discriminated against. They have the equality before the law in the enjoyment of the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and our module, the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Now, let's come to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child seeks to set out the civil, political, economic, social, health, and cultural rights of children. The convention opened for signature on 20th November 1989 and it came into force on the 2nd of September 1990. At present, it has 194 parties and 140 signatories. Article 13 of the convention protects the freedom of expression. You're now looking at a map of the member states that are a party to the convention. Interestingly enough, the United States of America, the world's oldest democracy, has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child but has not ratified it, essentially, which means that the Senate in the United States and the Congress has not yet passed it. There are a few non-signatory states, but you can see that India is one of those parties to the convention. Now let's look at Article 13 of the convention. Now coming to Article 13 of the convention, Clause 1. The child shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of the child's choice. Now, again, look how this is different from the UDHR and the ICCPR. Much like the Convention Against the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, this convention caters to a specific group, that group being children. It says the children shall have the right to freedom of expression, and more interestingly, it says that the child has the right to receive, seek, and impart information through a media of the child's choice. The choice is of the child and not any guardian or adult. Clause 2. The exercise of this right may be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary for the respect of the rights or reputation of others, or for the protection of national security or of public order or public health or morals. So, for example, let us look at the movie rating system. You have a universal rating or you have an adult rating. If you have an adult movie rating, can a child claim under the convention that his or her rights are violated? The answer is a no. Although the child has the right to seek, receive, and impart information, a state may restrict this right in the interests of public health or morals. So you could argue that to have 10-year-old children viewing films of a pornographic nature, of an adult nature, goes against public morals, and therefore that restriction would be justified. Now we come to the regional instruments that protect the right to free speech and expression. Perhaps the most important and significant regional instrument is the European Convention on Human Rights, the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, as it is also known. The ECHR is undoubtedly the one instrument that binds all of Europe together. All Council of Europe member states are party to the convention. The convention is a breakthrough as it provides for a European Court of Human Rights. This is where the European Convention of Human Rights has far more teeth as compared to the ICCPR or the UDHR or other international instruments. While states have a problem in agreeing on an enforcement mechanism, the nations of Europe have clearly agreed on that mechanism, and that mechanism is the European Court of Human Rights, which is located in Strasbourg. The European Court of Human Rights decisions are binding over national courts. So, for example, the highest court of the land today in the United Kingdom is not the Supreme Court or the erstwhile House of Lords, but in fact is the European Court of Human Rights, located outside the United Kingdom. A transnational court passing binding judgment, essentially, has made the convention highly effective, and most of the member states adhere to it very strictly. The convention, in its Article 10, protects the freedom of expression. So now let's consider Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Article 10. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. This article shall not prevent states from requiring the licensing of broadcasting, television, or cinema enterprises. Therefore, Article 10 of the ECHR, much like the other international instruments, speaks of the freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas. However, where it is different is it explicitly states that member states are not barred from requiring the licensing of broadcasting, television, or cinema enterprises, and any requirements imposed by the state for broadcasting or television or cinema enterprises is not a violation of Article 10. Now, let's come to the curbs on the right to free speech and expression under Article 10 of the European Court of Human, under the European Convention on Human Rights. The exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. Now let us break down each and every one of these restrictions. First, the European Convention on Human Rights justifies curbs on the right to free speech and expression, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities. And they say that with great freedom comes great responsibility. So what are some of these restrictions? They may be in the interest of national security, something that threatens the very existence of the state. Territorial integrity, may be a war, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, again, public order. We have dealt with all of this in the module. For the protection of health or morals, we dealt with the adult rating for, say, a cinema that prevents children, for example, from watching such films. For the protection of the reputation rights of others, defamation, again, we have dealt with this. The European Convention of Human Rights is very clear that yes, the right to hold opinions and to impart those opinions is sacrosanct, but it cannot be done so to the damage of somebody else's reputation. And the European Convention of Human Rights is unique in some of the other restrictions that it justifies. It says you may restrict the right to hold, impart, seek, and receive information for the preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence. For example, you go and see a psychiatrist and you tell him personal details of your life, or you go and see a lawyer and you confide that you have committed a crime. This information is essentially protected by what is known in law as privilege. This is privileged information, because when you go to your psychiatrist or you go to your lawyer, what you're saying basically to them is in confidence, because if that confidence was betrayed, people would be deterred from, for example, from seeking help when they have mental health issues. Therefore, a psychiatrist cannot disclose that information claiming his right to free speech and expression, because that disclosure is prevented, because the information that he is about to disclose was received in confidence. Also, interestingly, the European Convention of Human Rights permits curbs on the right to free speech and expression for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. So, for example, judges may be prohibited from going on a television channel or speaking in public, or for that matter, anything that takes place in a court of law, there might be reporting restrictions imposed. For example, a trial of a minor or trial for rape. In these trials, the interest of the authority of the judiciary, impartiality of the judiciary is necessary, and the court might say, and the state might say that it is necessary to impose reporting restrictions. France is a very good example where you are not even allowed to show an individual in handcuffs, unlike the United States. The case of Dominique Strauss-Kahn comes to mind. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was arrested in the United States on suspicion of sexually assaulting a maid in a New York hotel. He was shown in handcuffs being arraigned at a New York court, and this image caused outrage in France because they believed that such images being broadcast on national television would essentially affect Dominique Strauss-Kahn's right to a fair and impartial trial. Now let's come to the American Convention on Human Rights. The American Convention on Human Rights was also known as the Pact of San Jose, was adopted by many American countries, North and South, on 22nd November 1969. The convention establishes two bodies, the Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court, to oversee its compliance. Again, the presence of a court gives this convention teeth. The object of the convention is to consolidate in this hemisphere, within the framework of democratic institutions, a system of personal liberty and social justice based on respect for the essential rights of man. In Article 13 of the Convention, we once again find that it protects the freedom of thought and expression. Article 13, once again, is worth reading in extenso. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought and expression. This right includes freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, in print, in the form of art, or through any other medium of one's choice. Sound familiar? We've already gone through this 3 or 4 times in the previous international conventions. Again, the exercise of the right provided for in the foregoing paragraph shall not be subject to prior censorship. And again, we find nuances, small differences between these instruments. Article 13 of the American Convention on Human Rights basically states that there shall be no prior restraint, no prior censorship. What that essentially means is you will let somebody express that opinion and then you will subsequently take action. You will not censor them. You will not prevent them from expressing that opinion in the first place. What else does it say? It says that although prior censorship is not allowed, it shall be subject to subsequent imposition of liability, as I've just told you, which shall be expressly established by law to the extent necessary to ensure a respect for the right or reputation of others, again defamation, we've been through this, the protection of national security, public order, public health or morals, and once again we've been through this. The real key takeaway from Article 13 of the American Convention is that there is no prior censorship as a general rule, and only in the interest of defamation or national security, public order, public health or morals can there be prior censorship. Article 13 continues, the right of expression may not be restricted by indirect methods or means, such as the abuse of government or private controls over newsprint, radio, broadcasting frequencies or equipment used in the dissemination of information, or by any other means tending to impede the communication and circulation of ideas and opinions. States like Chile come to mind, where General Augusto Pinochet controlled the means of communication. What Article 13 wants to emphasize is that indirect methods of curbing the right to freedom of speech and expression also cannot be resorted to. You might say that somebody may go write a newspaper article, but if you prevent the publication of that newspaper, or you deny that newspaper a license, or somebody goes on a news channel and you black out this news channel, it is not sufficient for the state to say that yes, the person expressed the opinion on the news channel, but it was not broadcast because we chose not to broadcast it. That is an indirect way, essentially, of interfering with someone's right to hold, seek, impart, and receive information. Notwithstanding the provisions of paragraph 2, goes on Article 13, public entertainment may be subject by law to prior censorship. Here again we come to the films. Adult films, for example, may be subject to prior censorship. Objectionable content, they may be subject to prior censorship. However, the article is very specific on what grounds films can be pre-censored. It's on what grounds films can be censored. It says that the grounds are for the moral protection of childhood and adolescence. So essentially, you want to prevent anyone who is, say, under 16 or under 18 from watching a pornographic film because you believe it is in their interest. It is in the interest of the moral protection of childhood and adolescence. Any propaganda, goes on the convention, for war and any advocacy of national, racial or religious hatred that constitute incitements to lawless violence or to any other similar action against any person or group of persons on any grounds, including those of race, color, religion, language or national origin, shall be considered as offences punishable by law. The convention is very clear on its position on hate speech and speech that is likely to incite violence against a particular racial or ethnic minority or group or religion, that is not permissible, and they will be considered as offences punishable by law. To conclude, let's look at the final regional instrument, African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The charter, also known as the Banjul Charter, came into effect on 21st October 1986. The charter seeks to promote and protect human rights and basic freedoms in the African continent. At present, it has been ratified by 53 nations, including all members of the African Union except for Sudan. It remains to be seen when that troubled country will actually ratify the convention. Article 9 of the African Charter declares that every individual shall have the right to receive information and every individual shall have the right to express and disseminate his opinions within the law. Again, that old restriction, it has to be within the law. So, students, let's recap what we've done in this module. We have looked at various international instruments and regional instruments. Some of the international instruments that we've considered are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We've seen that in all these instruments, the right to freedom of speech and expression is given pride of place. It is an extremely important right that every convention, no matter what its subject matter, that is remotely related to human rights, guarantees the right to free speech and expression, guarantees the right to hold an opinion, guarantees the right to seek, receive, and impart information. Thus, the right to freedom of speech and expression gets pride of place in the pantheon of fundamental human rights. It has been recognized, of course, albeit with certain limitations and restrictions, through the international instruments and regional instruments. Some of these restrictions commonly are in the interest of defamation, public health, public order, and public morals. It can thus, therefore, be safely concluded that the right forms the linchpin of a vibrant democratic society.